Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Revelation class. We are in class number 5 today, and we'll be looking at Revelation 1, verses 17 through 20, and we're also going to begin the introduction to the 7 churches, which is chapter 2 and chapter 3 of Revelation today. So that's what we'll be accomplishing. If you're watching with us at home, you can get the same notes that people have here in class. Just if you go to the upper right of your screen and click on See More, you'll find a way to get through to the notes, and from there you can have the same notes that everyone in class is having. We welcome all of you that are watching online. I have an announcement to make before we get going very far, and that's that next week I won't actually be here. Some of you may or may not know that I am a first responder, and I have been for the last 32 years. I'm on the National Ski Patrol, so in the wintertime I take care of people who hurt themselves on ski hills. I give them first aid and haul them down the hill and take care of them. And in order to do that, every year I have to recertify all my first aid skills, and I have to do that on the second Sunday of October every year. So next week I will be gone up in Michigan, and I will be recertifying first aid skills. So if you're going to have a heart attack or something, please don't do it next week, because I won't be here to tend to you. But I will be gone. However, Stephen will be teaching next week.
The heart attack is going to come.
So, yeah, don't have your heart attack while Stephen's here. Although we do have an AED out here if you chose to have one. Anyway, I will be gone next week. For those of you that watch online, unfortunately, we will not be recording next week. So next week we will not have a class up on the system online. But don't worry, in terms of Revelation, you will not miss anything. Revelation class number 6 I will do when I return, which is 2 weeks from today. So just want to make sure everyone understood that about the class. But we are going to have an awesome class next week. Stephen has so much to share with us about what's going on in the world and in his world. So let's begin. So last week, where we left it was John had just seen a vision of Jesus in his glorified godly state. And it was amazing. It was incredible. We showed you some other places in the Bible where other people, in particular Daniel, had seen almost exactly the same view of Jesus in his glorified state. And last week we saw John's vision of it, and we went through that vision. Now, one of the things to realize is that a lot of us have pictures of Jesus around, and we have pictures of this beautiful man, blonde or whatever color he was, man. And we think of him as a human being, but we need to realize there was only a unique period of 34 years in human history when he was ever a human being. He really, throughout history, he has been God. And he was God before he was a human being, he's God today, and he will be God forever. And he exists in a godly state, in a state that we can't even imagine. It would knock us right off our feet if we saw what Jesus really looks like. So John actually got the opportunity to do that during Revelation. We saw that last week. That was chapter 1. Was John got an opportunity to see what Jesus looks like in his godly state. So having said that, let's move now into verse 17, which is the first verse from today's. If you're watching at home, you'll have to get your Bible out and find Revelation 1, verse 17. This is John speaking. And he's speaking about the vision of Jesus. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last." Okay, so John, at this point, still hasn't quite recognized that it's Jesus. Now bear in mind that 60 years earlier, John was one of Jesus' closest friends. They knew each other very, very well 60 years earlier. And all of a sudden, Jesus appears in his godly form. He looks a little bit like a man, but not really like a man. And John is stunned by this. He hasn't figured out that it's Jesus. So what he does is he falls on his face. He is just stunned. He's shocked. He just realizes that he is seeing a vision of God and that he is a mortal man and he doesn't know what to do, so he falls on his face. He says, "as though dead." Now this reminds us of some other characters in the Bible that have done the same thing, and I want to review some of those with you this morning. The first is Moses. In Exodus 3, verse 6, Moses' reaction to God when he saw him in the burning bush, and he didn't actually see God, he just saw the burning bush. This is Moses, or Exodus 3, verse 6. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So Moses' reaction was to hide his face. Right? Joshua 5:14, Joshua does something pretty similar. And I'll read you that here. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" So Joshua falls down on the earth and bows to at that point. Ezekiel has a reaction. Ezekiel sees him also in Ezekiel 1:28. This is a beautiful passage. I love this whole passage of Ezekiel 1. But Ezekiel's reaction to seeing him is, "And when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard a voice speaking." So again, we can picture him just falling on the ground on his face, not able to look at what he's seeing. And finally, in Daniel 8:17, Daniel actually had visions like this a couple times, but I'm going to show you one of them from 8:17. Daniel says, "So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end.'" So Jesus was also giving Daniel a vision of the time of the end, much as he's giving John a vision of that here. But again, the impact on Daniel was tremendous. He just fell on the ground and didn't know what to do and hid his face from Christ. And that's exactly what John did here. So what does Jesus do? Jesus puts his right hand on John's shoulder or on his head, we're not quite sure, but he comforts John with his right hand. And before we talk about what Jesus said, let's look at the idea of the right hand of God. And that's something we see in the Bible. We see it in a lot of places. It goes all the way back to Genesis 48:15. That's the first time we ever see a discussion about the right hand. And this actually is the story of Jacob as he was getting ready to die, blessing Judah's sons. Now, bear in mind, Judah was going to be the kingly one. Of Jacob's 12 sons, Judah was going to be the kingly one. So Judah had 2 sons, and those were Ephraim and Manasseh. And Manasseh was the oldest, so he would be the one who would eventually inherit the crown, and Ephraim was the youngest. But Jacob decided to change that. And Jacob, when he was blessing the 2 boys, he brought them forward, he put his right hand out, and Judah moved Manasseh, the oldest, out there to get the blessing from his right hand, and he put Ephraim on the left to get the blessing. But what Jacob did was he crossed his arms. And when he crossed his arms, he actually blessed Ephraim, the youngest, and didn't bless Manasseh, or not in the same way, didn't bless Manasseh, the oldest. So this is the first time we ever see the right hand being used as a way of blessing by, well, in this case it was Jacob, but eventually it will turn into God blessing that way as well. In Matthew chapter 25, when we look at the sheep and the goats judgment, we see something very similar happen. The sheep and the goats judgment happens right after the second coming, where Jesus gets everybody in front of him, and he puts the people that have been faithful to him on his right hand, and the people who have not been faithful to him on his left hand. And he is about ready to pronounce judgment on them. And the people on his right hand that have been faithful to him, he calls the sheep. And the people on his left hand that have not been faithful to him, he calls the goats. Let's look at this. It's in Matthew 25, verses 32 to 33. All the nations will be gathered before him. Before him would be Jesus. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. So Jesus here is using his right hand to comfort John, and that was a very significant thing. A right hand, especially the right hand of God, shows a special comfort on someone. We don't do that tradition today, but in those days that was a big tradition, was to use your right hand to comfort someone, to put your hand on their head or on their shoulder or whatever. I guess we still do some of that today when we're blessing people. Moving to the second page of your notes, by the way. So now Jesus speaks, and we're still in verse 17. Jesus speaks, and he says, I am the first and the last. Now, about 2 weeks ago when we were doing verse 8, we saw the Father say the same thing. The Father said, when he was speaking from the throne, say, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha is Greek for the first letter of the alphabet, and Omega is Greek for the last letter of the alphabet. So the Father was saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. Here Jesus is saying, I am the first and the last. So he's making it very clear that he is God. This is obviously Jesus. We said last week, it's one who looks like the Son of Man. So this is clearly Jesus in this vision, and he is clearly declaring that he is God by using exactly the same phrase, only we have it in English, they have it in Greek, but exactly the same phrase as the Father used. So he's equating himself fully to the Father. He's fully God, is what he's saying here. Moving on now to verse 18. Read you verse 18. I am the living one. This is Jesus speaking now. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. So let's take a look at the things that Jesus says. The first thing he says is, I am the living one. So I went and looked to try to find some other place in the Bible where that phrase is ever used, and it isn't used anywhere else. This is the only place Jesus is ever referred to as the living one. And by the way, it's capitalized in our text. I don't know enough about Greek to know if it's capitalized in the original text, but it is capitalized in our text. So Jesus is the living one. So what he's trying to say here, I think, is two things. Number one is he rose from the dead. He was dead, and then he rose. He rose from the dead at the resurrection. I think the second thing he's trying to say is that he lives. He is forever. He has lived since the beginning, since before the foundations of the universe. He lived while he was alive. He rose again after he died on the cross, and now he lives forevermore. So he is the living one. He lives forever. So Jesus is explaining that piece of himself to John here in this. He says, I was dead, and now look, I am alive. So he's talking there, of course, about the crucifixion, his death on the cross, 3 days in the tomb, and 3 days later he rose, and now he is alive again. So he was brought back to life after being dead, after appearing to be dead or being dead to us. He was brought back to life. And then it goes on to say forever and ever. Forever and ever clearly means a long time, right? Clearly means this, that Jesus is going to be alive forever. He's been alive forever, and he will be alive forever. You know, anytime I hear the Hallelujah chorus sung, it makes me think of the various words that come from there, or come to there, that come from Revelation, and there's one of them, forever and ever. You know, same thing. That comes from this particular phrase here, this particular verse here. So the Hallelujah chorus is very glorious, very uplifting, and I think part of it is because Jesus is glorious and he's uplifting. Then Christ goes on to say that, by the way, he's describing himself here by his eternal characteristics. We no longer see Jesus as a man now. In Revelation, we see him as God. In the Gospels, we saw him as man. In Revelation, we see him as God. So he's showing us his eternal characteristics. He tells John that he holds the keys to death and Hades. Death means two things. It means physical death, but it also, more importantly, it means spiritual death. It means death forever. It means death in Hades, death, for separation from God forever. So Jesus is saying here that he holds the key between connection with God forever and separation from God forever. And the beautiful part of that is we get to make that decision ourselves. We get to make the decision in our own lives in this time on this earth of whether we want to connect with Jesus and connect with him forever. That connection is forever. Or whether we want to separate from Jesus and separate from him forever. And it's beautiful that we get the chance to make that decision, and hopefully every one of us have done that in this room. If not, I urge you to do it as quickly as you can. Let's move on now to verse 19.
I have a question though.
Yes.
Is there a difference between death and Hades and why they are keys in plural?
Wow, good question. Is there a difference between death and Hades? Hades is a place that is mentioned a couple times in the Bible, and it is a place where people who are dead go who are not with Christ or who are not with God. So yeah, I would say death is the actual dying, the actual, being apart from God is what I would define as death. And Hades is a place that you go when you're apart from
He's
God.
using keys. That means there's a key to death and there's a key to Hades.
Yeah, the key is him. He is the key.
Okay.
He is the key. That's how I would interpret it. I mean, there might be another interpretation out there, but that's how I would interpret it, is that Christ himself is the key to that. In other words, we get to choose Christ or not choose Christ. If we choose him, we've chosen the key to eternal life with Christ, eternal life with God. If we don't choose him, then we've chosen the key to death, eternal death, and we will end up in Hades. I think that's what's being said there.
Okay. That's signifying too that there is a separation between the two, that this death can no longer, death is no longer sting, or otherwise.
What is that, Steve?
Once you have eternal life, there's not that, there's that separation, like sin can never come over into eternal
Right.
life.
Yeah. God is all holy. He is perfect.
Yes.
Once we are in the presence of God, we will be in a world, in a universe, whatever you want to call it, that is all holy and all perfect. And I think sin will be gone at that point. That's my interpretation of what I see.
It's locked away,
Exactly.
and it cannot
Yeah.
enter into the presence.
And the verse
of
you're
God,
talking about is
separated.
from Hosea. I actually taught that just a few months ago, and that death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? That comes from the book of Hosea. So yeah, that's that's exactly what I think of it. Other questions? By the way, feel free to ask questions. Everybody has questions about Revelation. But
Well, something that goes with his question, I think of that rich man and Lazarus, when he wanted a drop of water on his tongue, the rich man, and Abraham said that you can't do that, you can't go from here to there. And
Yeah.
he said, well, tell my brothers. He said, well, they didn't listen to Moses and them, they're not going to listen to anybody else either. But what he was saying is, once you're there, you don't go from one to the other.
yeah, we make the decision. The whole purpose of our existence on this earth, for however many years we're here, is to make that decision. That's why God put us here. We need to make the decision: are we going to be with Jesus, be with God, or are we going to be apart from him? And if we're going to be with God, then we will. If we make that decision, then we will be with him forever. And if we don't make that decision, we will be apart from him forever. And I think one of the things is we will get a chance to see God at the last judgment if we don't choose him, and we'll realize what we're missing. Forever we will know what we have missed. So yeah, I think it sounds pretty final to me. The way I read stuff in the scriptures, it sounds pretty final to me.
Then that describes the torment, because we will know what we missed.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, we have pictures of fire and all that stuff, and there are visions of that in the Bible, but I really, personally, I think the biggest thing is we're going to realize we are apart from God. We will have seen him once at judgment time, and we will realize what we've missed. And we will be apart from God for eternity and know exactly what we missed. So that's how I view it. I think that's the biggest punishment if we
I think so too.
miss it.
There's
I think more so than fire and torment. I
Right.
think that's the thing.
There's some Christians actually who deny eternal damnation nowadays. That it's not eternal, that it's just short.
Yeah.
So we need to kind of.
There's a lot of false teaching in the church, and it's very clear from the Gospels from which Jesus tells us that it is eternal. And there's a lot of false teaching in the church, and Jesus tells us to beware of false teachers. He's going to tell us again later on in Revelation to beware of false teachers, so that verse is coming later on too. But yeah, we need to beware of false teaching. That means we need to be studying the Bible for ourselves, and we need to understand ourselves what it means, so that when we're watching TV and somebody we think represents God is up there and says something that is wrong, that we'll know it's wrong and we won't be misled by it. We are in a time of a lot of deception. If you haven't noticed that around you in the world lately, there is a lot of deception going on out there. And, the best way to avoid being deceived is to understand what God has said for yourself. The better you understand what's in here, the better positioned you are to not be deceived as we go into these times. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to verse 19 if there's no other questions on verse 18. This is an important one, by the way. This is one of the ones that will lay out what's going to happen in the book of Revelation. This is Jesus speaking to John again. Write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. So, Jesus is telling John to do three things here. Write down the things you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. And by the way, I've actually taken this from the King James Version. It's a little different, but I'm sorry, from the
NIV.
No, not NIV. NIV is what you have in front of you. The actual wording I have up here was from, maybe I didn't put it in here. Might be RSV, I'm not sure. At any rate, the things you have seen, notice the tense of the verb here, have seen. That means it happened already, right? It's happened in the past. So Jesus is telling John, write down what you have seen. Notice the tense of the verb are or is in here. That's a current tense verb. What is, what are, things that are, what is, that's a current tense verb. And notice what will take place. That is the future. That is a future tense verb. So Jesus is telling John, write down things that you've seen already, things which are today, and things which will be in the future. So let's kind of go through those. A key thing here, you notice I underlined not only the word have, which means it's past tense, but also seen. It's important to realize that Revelation is not just about something that John heard or something that he was inspired by. This is something that John saw. He actually had a vision and he saw Jesus. So John actually has seen it. And Jesus has said, write down what you have seen. So what Jesus is talking about here to John in verse 19 is write down everything you've seen up to that point. It's past tense, so it's everything through verse 18, right? Everything you have seen. And what John has seen is Jesus in his godly glory. So what Jesus is telling John is, tell the people, tell us today, tell all of us about my eternal glory, about my godly glory, what I look like when I'm in glory, so that they realize that I am God, and they realize that someday they will see me as God. So that's the first part of Revelation. That is chapter 1 of Revelation. John is instructed to write down the things he has seen, past tense. It's already happened by the end of chapter 1. Then we come to the things which are, and we come to the things which will take place after these things. So we know the dividing line between the past and the present. It's the end of chapter 1, right? We know that in chapter 2 we're going to start the things that are. But we don't know where the things that are is going to end. And where the things that will take place are going to begin. But we actually do. We see it, the clue is in chapter 4, verse 1. I'm going to take you to that next. In chapter 4, verse 1, opens with the words, after this. That's the key. That chapter 4, verse 1 is the rapture. It is the beginning of the rapture. So everything from chapter 4, verse 1 on is the things that will take place after this. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 about the churches is the things that are. So the things that are we're going to look at the church. We're going to look at the entire church age. We're going to look at the church as it appeared at that time, at the time of John, and as it's appeared at the last 2,000 years. And we're going to look at the progress of what the church has done over those 2,000 years. And those are the things which are. Now, that might seem a little strange at first to you to say, but some of that isn't stuff that is today. Some of that is stuff that was 2,000 years ago when John wrote about it. But that's why it's important to realize that Christ has told John in this verse right here, has told John to divide what he's doing into three parts. Chapter 1, chapter 2 and 3, which is what things that are, and chapter 4, which is going to be marvelous. It's going to be all about all sorts of beautiful visions of the future, some of them scary, but all kinds of beautiful visions of the future. So John is being told to divide the book of Revelations into three parts. We've now completed part 1. Yes, Stephen?
Isn't that part of prophecy? It has to do with the past, the present, and the future. So in some sense, he's setting his prophetic.
Yeah, we're actually going to, when we get into the things that are, which is going to be the 7 churches, we're actually going to look at some prophetic stuff about the 7 churches.
I'm just saying, when you interpret prophecy, you have to, what does it mean in the past, what does it mean in the present, what does it mean in the future?
Right.
So he's setting up the book of Revelation as a prophecy, and
Yeah.
this is how you interpret. It always has 3 dimensions.
Yeah, those of you that have been in my classes as I've gone through a bunch of prophets from the Old Testament, I've been teaching prophecy here for a few years in the church, know that one of the things you hear from me repetitively when we're looking at whoever it may be, whether it be Zechariah or Daniel or Isaiah or Joel, is that the prophecies apply to 3 times. They apply to the time that they're in, whatever's going on at that time. They apply to the time of the first coming, when Jesus comes, and they apply to the second coming. And as we went through those and looked at all the various prophecies, I talked to you about how those prophecies, this prophecy applies to the time of Daniel, and this one to the first coming and the second coming, and so on. So yes, they can apply to different times. And part of our job as students of the Bible is to figure out what times they're talking about. At any rate, so we're going to start, we're going to be moving now shortly into the things which are. And that's my point here. So let's move on to verse 20. This is the last verse of chapter 1. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Now, if you go back 2 weeks ago, when John first turned around in the middle of this vision, the first thing he saw was 7 lampstands. And remember, a lampstand is a menorah. That's the thing with the 7 candles coming up, with the 1 candle in the middle being higher. So John turned around and saw 7 lampstands, and each lampstand, by the way, has 7 lights on it. So John turned around and saw the 7 lampstands. Remember, 7 is a perfect number in Revelation. 7 means, we talked about this back in week 1, I think it was. 7 means completeness. The completeness of God, the completeness of his church in this case. Kids today always use the term 100%. If you talk to millennials, they're forever saying 100%. So in millennial language, that's 100%. So 7 means the completeness or the 100%, the totality of something. So he turned around and saw 7 lampstands, and each one of them, of course, had 7 lights on it. And then, as he looked further, he saw Jesus holding 7 stars in his hands. And I told you at the time that we would explain later what those were, and now we're at that point. They seemed like a mystery at the time when we first saw them a number of weeks ago, but now Revelation actually gives us the answer. It tells us what they are. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And the 7 stars are the angels that protect those 7 churches. So let's talk about the churches first, and then I want to talk about guardian angels with you. The 7 churches, each church, as a church, we have a job. And our job is to bring the light of Christ to the world, right? That's our job as a church. That's what we're here for. That's why God put us here. Yeah, we need to take care of each other also, but our primary job is to bring the light of Christ to the world. That's what a lampstand does. A lampstand lights up a room. If you put a lampstand in a room and light all 7 of the candles, the room is lit. It's alive. It's got light in it. So that's what the job of the church is. Each of these 7 churches has the job to also do 7 kinds of light, in other words, perfect light, to the world. That's the light that God wants us to do in his world. So that's what the lampstands are. The lampstands are the 7 churches. I'm going to talk about the 7 churches in a bit here, but then in Jesus' right hand, he held 7 stars. And I think that's extremely important. And he says here that the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. So we know a couple of things here. One of them is that there are guardian angels. They really exist, right? God has a guardian angel for every church out there. He has it for each of these 7 churches. You can bet he's got one for our church as well. He's got a guardian angel for the church overall and a guardian angel for each church. So it's one of the places in the Bible that we learn about guardian angels, that we learn that God has put an angel here to watch over our church, to protect us, to keep us doing the right stuff. That's not to say that we always listen to that guardian angel, but hopefully we do. And hopefully that guardian angel brings us back onto the correct path. But these are the angels of the 7 churches. The other thing to notice, we talked earlier about the right hand of Jesus. Guess where Jesus is holding these guardian angels? He's holding them in his right hand. So he's holding them in his hand that shows his preference. And he's holding them close. So Jesus is guarding our church and guarding all of our churches by holding the angels that protect us in his hand very closely, in his right hand, the one that really counts. Great stuff, right? I just got notified in the back that I need to speak louder, so let me speak louder. By the way, if you can't hear me, please just kind of go like this, okay? Sorry, as my voice goes on through the hour, sometimes it drops, and I'm sorry about that, but just tell me to do this, and I'll try to get my voice back up again. So let's see. Where are we?
Could that also be not necessarily in a specific, but that God holds the heavenly realm and the earthly realm in his hand?
Of course he does, yeah. Of course
That's the
does,
general
yes.
meaning, and then the specific word of the guardian.
Yeah. Right. God holds us in his hand. If we are with him, he holds us in his hand. Yes. And yes, I agree with that. So there's a lot of comfort to be had from that, from the idea that God is holding our church in his hand. Our church today isn't facing a whole lot of persecution, but as Stephen knows, there are churches all around the world that are. And we're going to hear from a missionary today who's going to talk to us about Haiti. We're going to hear that there is persecution going on there around the world against the churches. And folks, it's coming here eventually. If you haven't figured that out yet, just wait a few years, it's coming. Persecution is coming here to the church in the United States. It is everywhere in the world today, other than us, or almost everywhere in the world. You're already seeing it in places in Europe. Canada, we've seen it in recently. Places you would never think of as being anything but godly places. All of a sudden, we're seeing persecution in those places. So persecution is coming, and we need to realize that God is going to protect us through that persecution. That's part of what's being said here when Christ says he's holding the spirit of the church in his hand during this period. It should be a great comfort to us as we enter into the period before the rapture when the persecution is happening, to know that Christ is holding us in his hand. So now we've finished chapter 1, and we're not actually going to start chapters 2 and 3 this week. I want to talk instead about the 7 churches. The 7 churches. Let me move over this way. There are 7 churches that Christ tells John to take this book to, the book of Revelation, this scroll, this manuscript. We're going to get into all 7 of them over the next several weeks and talk about them. There's 3 different ways to look at this. And I'm going to tell you what those 3 are, and then I'm going to tell you that I think all 3 of them are correct. And I think we need to look at the churches all 3 ways. The first way to look at the church is, obviously, these were historical churches that really existed at that time. And Jesus is literally saying to John, take the scroll and go to these churches and give them the scroll. Jesus is telling him that these churches are having these problems. We're going to see Jesus talk about each church and talk about what it's doing well, what it's doing poorly, and what it has to do to bring itself to him, and what will happen if it doesn't do that. So there's a structure to each of these 7 churches of how Jesus describes them. And those were literal churches. They all existed at that point in time. They were all in a place called, in a Roman province that was called Asia. Today we call it Turkey. But in those days it was called the Roman province of Asia. And all 7 of those, I'm going to speak about them specifically in a minute here, but all 7 of them were churches that existed at that time. The first one that we'll talk about eventually, we'll talk about that when I come back in 2 weeks, is Ephesus. And we know that Paul went to Ephesus. Paul wrote his letter to the Ephesians about Ephesus. We know that John was at the church of Ephesus at this time. Now, Paul was dead by this point, but John was at the church of Ephesus just before he went to Patmos. So Ephesus was a major church at that point in the church world. That's the one that we're going to start out with. So that's the first interpretation, is that these were 7 actual churches that really existed in 92 AD when John wrote the book of Revelation. These were 7 actual churches that existed, and all of them were experiencing persecution at that time. The Roman Emperor Domitian was in power. Domitian believed that he was God, and he believed that you needed to worship him. Domitian was an equal opportunity worshiper. He said, you can worship any other god you want, but you must worship me as God. Well, guess what happened with Christians when that came out? Christians said, ain't happening. And so Domitian started persecuting Christians. Now, it had happened before under Nero, but Domitian was the second emperor to really severely persecute Christians during that period. And he was persecuting Christians in this part of Asia. And these people in these churches knew it, and they needed some comfort. So these letters went to the people in those 7 churches to give them comfort. Now, there are people that will say that's all that this means. It's just something that happened 2,000 years ago. It was about 7 churches that existed at that time. By the way, none of them exist today. They're all gone. All 7 of these churches are gone. We'll talk about that as we get into it. And they're gone because they didn't do what Jesus told them to do in the book of Revelation. We'll talk about that as well. But these were 7 churches that actually existed at that time. But the second way to look at it, and I think that's a correct way to look at it, is that these were 7 actual churches, and this letter was to these people at this time. But I think the second way to look at it is, remember the word 7 is in here. Why did Jesus pick 7 churches? Why didn't he pick 12 or 6 or 3 or 9 or 418? Why 7? The reason is, we talked about this, the entire book of Revelation uses the word 7 50 times. And each time it's designed to show completeness. Just like the 7th day, it all goes back to chapter 2 of the Bible, chapter 2 of Genesis. On the 6th day, God made a creation. On the 7th day, he completed it, he rested. The completeness of God is 7. That's where 7 comes from, as completeness. 7 has always represented completeness in the Bible. That's why it is so prevalent in Revelation. That's why it's in there 50 times. Or in millennial language, it's 100%. So if you're talking to your grandchildren and they say it's 100%, yes, that means 7. That's complete.
24/7 or 100%.
Right. Every time I talk to a millennial, the word 100% comes up in the conversation somehow. So, at any rate, this is for them as well. At any rate, there are 7 churches. That's a key here. Why are there 7 churches? Because this is about the completeness of the church. Christ wasn't just sending this letter to 7 specific churches that were all going to be gone in a few years, or not a few years, but over time. Christ was sending this to the church of all time, to us, to the other churches everywhere in the world at that time, and to churches everywhere in the world today, to us. The things he's about to tell these 7 churches about what's going on with their own churches, what's good about them, what's bad about them, what's going to happen if they don't fix it, what's going to happen if they do fix it. All of the stuff we're going to see as we study these 7 churches all applies to our church today and every other church out there. Every church is different. Those of you that have been in other churches know all these churches are different. Some churches are more of a Smyrna church and some more of a Laodicea church and so on. But there are elements of this out in the church everywhere in the world today. So I think the second thing that's being pointed, that's happening here as we look at these 7 churches, is that we're looking at the completeness of the church, and I'm going to call this the church age. It's the last 2,000 years. It's the period from 92, well actually it's the period from Pentecost, which is 30 AD, until the rapture, whenever that's coming. It's a 2,000-year period. And during that 2,000-year period, it's been the church age. And there have been thousands upon thousands upon thousands of churches. Some have come and gone over that time. Some are still here. But each of those churches has different characteristics. And those characteristics are things that Christ talks to in this next 2 chapters. Those are the things which are. It's the churches not only as they were 2,000 years ago, but as they are even today, is what Jesus is talking about. So for the next 2 chapters, we're going to be studying the things which are. Now there's a third way, so I'm going to tell you that that's an appropriate way to do it as well, to study the 7 churches as applying, the 7 churches of chapter 2 and 3, as applying to all churches of that time and to all churches of all time. There is a third way to also look at this, and I'm going to tell you that that one is correct as well. Now this didn't start, people didn't figure this out until about 150 years ago, so this was not well realized at the time. And that's that the church has progressed over the last 2,000 years during the church age. We're not the same church we were when Peter and Paul and John and Thomas and all those people were out teaching. It's a different church today. It has progressed over time. As time's gone around the clock, it has progressed. We're in a different church world today than we were in 2,000 years ago. That would have been impossible to see at the beginning. There's no way at the beginning of the church age to see how it was ever going to play out. But now that we're coming to the end of the church age, we can look back and say, oh, wow, this was all about the church age. These 7 churches follow the church's pattern historically over a 2,000-year period. And as we go through each of these 7 churches over the next few weeks, we're going to see that each one of these was a distinct period in the church's history over that period of time. Each one of them was a specific period. And we'll actually assign dates to those and look at what happened during those periods and look at how that related to what was going on in the church world during that period. So there's 3 ways you can look at it. You can look at it as the actual churches, the completeness, the overall church, and the fact that every church has some of this in it, or as a progression during the church age. Now, one of the things that led people to realize that this was a way you could look at it was people took a map and wrote and put the 7 cities on there. And when they did, here's what they found. The story starts, the first church is the Church of Ephesus, which is right on the coast of Turkey. By the way, Israel's over there, Egypt's down here, Greece is over here to give you an idea. But it starts at the Church of Ephesus. Then it moves to the Church of Smyrna, which is the second church. Then it moves to the Church of Pergamum, which is the third church. Then it moves to the Church of Thyatira, which is the fourth church. Then it moves to the Church of Sardis, which is the fifth church. Then it moves to the Church of Philadelphia, which is the sixth church. We have a city named after that in the United States. Then finally it moves to the seventh church, the Church of Laodicea. And when you look at these on a map, John in his day could have actually walked. A couple of days walked to here, a couple of days walked to there, a couple of days, a couple of days, a couple of days, a couple of days. And when he got down, he would have been almost back to Ephesus. Not quite, but almost back to Ephesus. Now you might notice something about that pattern. Well, I have a digital watch. There's a watch on the wall back there. It moved clockwise. By the way, I apologize. Last week I showed it counterclockwise. My mistake. It moved clockwise. It moved clockwise over that time. So the 7 churches, as Jesus takes us through them over the next few weeks, move in a clockwise pattern.
So that supports the third view, too.
It supports the third view. Now, some of you might be saying, wait a minute, did they really have clocks back in those days? No, they didn't. They did not have clocks until about 1,000 years later. But they did have something called sundials. And those of you that have a sundial know that the sundial has a peak point on it. And as the sun hits that and moves during the day, that point moves around. And guess what direction it moves? It moves clockwise around the sundial. So they did have sundials as far back as the ancient Egyptians in about 3,000 years ago. So they did have sundials a long ways back, and sundials moved clockwise. So when the first clocks came along hundreds of years ago, they made them go clockwise because that's how sundials went. So there's a piece of trivia you can amaze your friends with. Nobody realized until about 150 years ago, nobody really sat down and put this there and said, wait a minute, these churches are in a sequence. Maybe we should think about these 7 churches as being the history of the church over 2,000 years. All of a sudden, people are thinking that. I think it's a correct interpretation. This is probably the one that's most open to argument of the 3 interpretations, but people are thinking that today. I think it's a correct interpretation. As we go through it, we're going to see that the church was very much like the church of Ephesus during the apostolic age, which is the point where the apostles were still on earth. The church was very much like that. And we're going to see as we get around to eventually, and I'm several weeks in the future here, when we get to the church of Laodicea, we're going to see that the church of Laodicea was a very rich church where the people had so much money that they didn't need God. And they just said, hey, we don't need God. We can do this on our own. Now, if that sounds anything like our world today, guess what?
Duh.
Yeah, maybe we're in the church of Laodicea today, which is the last of the 7 churches. So as we study Revelation, we're going to have some fun with this. We're going to have some fun with looking at Revelation from all 3 of these points of view. Of what did it look like in John's age? Does every church have some elements of this? And the answer is yes. Every church has some elements of these 7 churches. But some churches are more like one than another as we go through them. We'll talk about our church as we go through it. And then finally, is the church progressing during this 2,000-year church age? And what does that progress look like? And it's so interesting that God laid this out in a way that looks like a clock, or like a sundial. So those are things that we're going to study as we go through this over the next few weeks. Let's see.
Ephesus is the only city that's still in existence. You can see it, but the rest of them are.
Yeah, you're stealing a little bit of my thunder from 2 weeks from now, but yes, Ephesus.
Go away, you come back.
You can still go to Ephesus, and it is ruins. Ephesus actually got destroyed. It is ruins today. It is not a real city today in the sense that it was at that time. You can go there and see the ruins, but it's not a real city anymore. And we're going to talk about why, what God did to destroy Ephesus. About 100 years, during about the next 100 years after John. Again, I'm stealing a little bit of my thunder, but
Sorry.
Christ told John things that Ephesus had to do if they were going to survive. Obviously, they didn't do them because within the next 100 years, God brought Ephesus to an end. Interesting. I'm sorry, you had a
I may be getting ahead of you too, but have you ever run across that Laodicea means rights of the people?
I have not run across that.
Okay,
We
I
will.
read that and I thought, well, that fits today also, but I'm not sure if that's what it really means.
Yeah, each church has a meaning. Each city has a meaning in Greek. Honestly, I haven't gotten that far into Laodicea yet. I've gotten to next week's church. Ephesus means desirable or desired in Greek. So we're going to talk about the names of the churches. Philadelphia means lover of God, by the way. If those of you that don't know that, Benjamin Franklin used to say that. That Philadelphia means lover of God.
No, love.
Huh?
Lovers are friendly love. Philadelphia.
Okay. All right.
Not love of God.
You're probably correct.
Sorry.
Maybe I haven't studied that enough. We'll get to that. We'll get to Philadelphia several weeks from now. We'll get to it. Okay, so moving on to the last page here. So an obvious question comes up. Why is the church age ending? It's been here for 2,000 years. Why is God bringing the church to an end? That's what Revelation's all about. We're going to study that. We're going to learn about it. Why is the church age coming to an end? And what will happen, how will that happen, and what will replace it? That's what Revelation is all about. So we're going to spend several weeks looking at the church age. Then as we get into chapter 4, which is the rapture, and begin to go through the whole story of the future, we'll understand why God is bringing the church age to an end and how that whole process will unfold during that period as the church age comes to an end. It's interesting that this 7-stage progression of the church age, once we understand it and we really understand what has happened to the church over the last 2,000 years, and we'll figure that out over the next few weeks, we're going to understand just how close to the end of the church age we really are. And I think as we see that progression, you'll see, wow, we might be pretty close to the end of the church age. Anyway, this is Jesus' marvelous plan. It was his plan all along to bring the church age to an end at some point. So, questions? Okay, remember, I won't be here next week. Stephen will be teaching. But I will be back in 2 weeks, and we will do class number 6. We'll get into the first church in Ephesus, and perhaps into the second church as well. So, thank you. For those of you at home, thank you very much for... I didn't mean to imply you could skip next week.
That's okay.
For those of you
That's
at
what I
home,
was saying.
thank you for joining us, and remember, there won't be a tape up next week of next week's class. Thank you.